Wondery.
From Wondery, I'm Lindsay Graham, and this is American Scandal. Today, we wrap up our series on the Unabomber. Between 1978 and 1995, Ted Kaczynski led a campaign to stop the advance of modern technology. Kaczynski was a former math professor, and as an undergrad at Harvard, his life was profoundly changed after he took part in a brutal psychological experiment. Kaczynski was left bitter and bent on getting revenge at scientists and those he believed were advancing technology. So he began mailing and planting bombs across the country. This campaign would kill 3 people and injure many more. He was known by the FBI as the Unabomber, and the manhunt to find him lasted nearly 2 decades. It would become the longest and most expensive case in FBI history. The publication of Kaczynskis Manifesto in 1995 led to a break in the case when Kaczynski's brother, David, noticed similarities between the manifesto and his brother's letters. Soon, agents arrested Kaczynski in his cabin in rural Montana. The Unabomber case was a milestone for the FBI, but Kaczynski also had a large influence across American culture. His manifesto, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, featured a scathing critique of science and technology. Kaczynski argued that industrial life was destroying the human spirit and the planet. It was an argument that gained traction with a variety of movements, including radical environmentalists and those who reject civilization. Today I'm speaking with John H. Richardson, a journalist and author who's written about those movements. While working on a story about environmental activists, he also began exchanging letters with Ted Kaczynski himself. We'll talk about Kaczynski, his vision of a perfect world, and how his message might still resonate today. That's next.
Wondery's shocking true crime podcast, Over My Dead Body, is back for a 3rd season with a story about corruption, betrayal, and the secrets of a fallen hero. Follow Over My Dead Body, Season 3, Fox Lake, on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening right now.
John Richardson, welcome to American Scandal.
Good to be here.
Let's start with Kaczynski's Manifesto. It's 35,000 words long, and in it, Kaczynski focuses on 2 main ideas. I was wondering if you could tell us what they are.
Well, basically, that technology is uncontrollable because it's too large a system to be controlled by any entity or governing body or anything like that. And it's really in control of the world rather than us making the decisions, driving things forward, whether we want it to or not. And that it's going to be a disaster for humanity and that it should be stopped.
35,000 words is a long time to spend on just those 2 or 3 points. How far into detail did he get?
Well, I mean, he talks about organizing and ideas of primitive life and a lot of different aspects of the critique. He talks about how technology and civilization, in his opinion, causes psychological illnesses and makes people, as he calls it, feral. He talks about the difference between left and right and how they fall into the spectrum of his analysis. I mean, he goes into a lot of subjects. The history of anti-technology he glosses into a little bit. He's certainly not the first person who's had these ideas. But basically, the thing that distinguishes his book is that it calls for revolution and something to actually be done about it rather than just being a social analysis as other scholars and thinkers have done over the last couple centuries.
Well, if we presume that revolution does come, did Kaczynski have any cohesive vision of his utopia? What would it look like to live in the world he wanted to see?
He talks about primitive life as a sort of hunter-gatherer kind of ideal, but I'm not sure that that's something that he particularly posits as something that would be pleasant. And he doesn't seem all that interested in exactly how anti-civilization would be constructed after some kind of collapse. He's really more interested, I think, in the critique of how technology, in his opinion, both makes us helpless, robs us of agency, and is getting larger and larger and more destructive. That's the critique he's more interested in, I think, than what life should look like.
I find that surprising, given that we all know Ted Kaczynski because of his acts of violence in order to enact a revolution.
Well, I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think that he reacted to the incursion of roads and housing and cabins and stuff like that into his wilderness in a very emotional and angry way. He says himself, his reaction was wanting revenge. Some people say that he came up with the philosophy later to justify his killings. In my opinion, I mean, he obviously had those kinds of anti-civilization ideas because he went to live in the woods in the first place. And I think it was a combination of emotional and reaction mixed with a growing political conviction that civilization was the enemy. Now, if you look at his thoughts about revolution that he's written, this is not consistent with killing people randomly. That's not a tactically effective thing to do. It never has been, particularly unless you just want to cause chaos. So his acts are not consistent with that more, what you might call, if you wanted to, mature philosophy, where he does the whole social critique that sort of puts his acts in context, I guess.
Well, let's stick with the manifesto. In 1995, it was published in the Washington Post and reached an international audience. Do you have an idea of what the public reaction was to his ideas?
Well, at the time, there was the popular reaction, which was weird hermit killer, and there was a more sort of a counterculture Ted for president campaign. Then there was a sort of some serious academic critiques looking at it by people in places like the New York Times, by important physicists and technologists, and have been all ever since. So I think all of those are sort of completely different Ted Kaczynskis.
Could we characterize those that took the manifesto seriously as a sort of following?
Well, I think there's definitely been people who have seen him as a inspiring figure or sympathetic or of the similar mind. So definitely, in Foreign Policy magazine a couple of years ago, they argued that there were a couple thousand committed, ready for revolution, anti-civ people in the U.S. I have no idea whether that's right. And there have been consistently groups overseas making the same claim, some who explicitly are Kaczynski inspired. But I wouldn't overstate it. I don't think there's any kind of revolutionary army out there waiting to make an attack. And most people who are anti-civ these days are aware of Kaczynski, but are not necessarily directly, acolytes of him. A few people would admit to that.
Well, you have an interesting relationship with Kaczynski yourself. In 2016, you wrote to him. He was still in a supermax prison in Colorado, serving concurrent life sentences.
Where he remains.
Yes, where he remains. Why did you reach out to him?
I'd been covering climate change stories for Esquire magazine for a few years. And during the course of that, I became aware of people who had sort of given up hope that there would ever be any effective global action against it. And when you start to look at those people, you end up stumbling across the Kaczynskiites, because it's sort of like, we told you so. So I started looking at that, and it reminded me of somebody I had met a decade before who had espoused those ideas. And so that intrigued me, I guess, the connection with the actual person I knew and liked. So I just started interviewing people, as a reporter does, thinking maybe there was a story there. And eventually I ended up writing to him.
For most people who perhaps are not reporters, it's not a natural course of things to reach out to a mass murderer. How did that feel?
Well, I've done killers and gang stories before. I was a crime reporter for a while. It's not that far out of what I would normally do. I did a story where I spent a week with a hitman from the Sinaloa cartel. That's what you do.
Well, in this instance, what did you talk about? Where did the conversation go?
Gee, it's been a long time since the beginning. First I was just saying I was interested in doing a story about him and his followers and his ideas and all that. And he was dismissive and a bit contemptuous of my magazine. But he was pretty funny about it. He quoted Paul Goodman. He said, "As I understand it, Esquire is a magazine that goes around and around and ends up coming up with no real point in its articles." So we batted that one around for a couple letters and basically I tried to get him to continue writing and respond and play it out. And he's, like I said, dismissive. He's very sort of aloof in a lot of ways, certainly at first. And then and I just kept trying.
Well, I can imagine anyone in Kaczynski's place, and certainly of his temperament, being aloof and dismissive of the press. But like you said, you kept at it. Did you gain any notion of Kaczynski as a person, as perhaps the relationship warmed?
Well, he definitely has a sense of humor. He's funny in an acerbic kind of English prep school way. He's very scholarly. His letters have footnotes and citations and page references to my letters or to whoever he's writing to. He tends to be cool temperament. If you've read his book, he is a mathematician. He tends to be sort of hyper-rational. It's kind of like being with a guy in college who's really smart and you're batting things around, and he's sort of snotty and superior and makes you work for your end of the conversation. Did you get any feeling that he enjoyed writing you? There were times when he said things that were not just in the course of response or all of that. We talked about music and boats, things that were off topic sort of about revolution and technology, although it always sort of crept in there. And when sometimes you could get quite antic and sort of like boyishly wanting to have fun with it. like language, playing with language, playing with fanciful concepts about adventure. I mean, I don't know. It was kind of unexpected. You never know what a person is really like, and people can create personas in letters, but he seemed to me, not really much different than anyone else that you would be corresponding with, except for the notoriety of his case and the peculiarity of his intellect.
I suppose it was inevitable that the two of you spent some time discussing politics and the idea of political revolution. Certainly, 2020 has been a year fraught with charged politics. Did Kaczynski have anything to say about the current moment?
Well, he's not a big admirer of Trump, and I sort of spoke of his administration as grifters and thieves. Those are not his exact words. He once said that if he had been able to vote in 2016, he would have voted for Hillary, which I thought was kind of funny. I think that although he devotes a lot of time to hating liberals, or leftists rather, in his manifesto, his sympathies are probably more in that direction than with conservatives. At least today's version. He's very interested in developments in technology and stuff like that. That's one of the ways that I got his interest, I guess, is I would write to him about developments in data mining and surveillance technology and things like that.
Yeah, certainly since he was arrested, quite a few things on the technological horizon have changed. Social media appeared and advanced artificial intelligence. Did this just confirm his suspicions?
Oh, no, yeah. No, and actually, if you look at the manifesto again, there's a surprising amount of stuff that really does seem prophetic. He talks about those kinds of technological surveillance, military, robot-type developments. Genetic engineering was a big concern for him, the idea of designer babies, and just a general, more and more departure from the natural world. I had done some pieces on computer algorithms and robots, and so I think that he's interested in that stuff, and we were able to talk about it.
One thing that's probably not changed much in his time in prison is his actual accommodations. He's used to small, cramped quarters, but how has he found prison?
He's not the kind of person who complains about physical discomforts or anything like that. I tried to sympathize with him once, because I had read an article about conditions there, and it said that it was terribly cruel because it was designed so that prisoners could never see the sun in maximum security. And so I said, yeah, I read that. That's terrible. What a horrible situation, especially for you. And he wrote back and he said, you're a journalist and you believe everything you read. What an idiot. I can see the sky. And then he gave me a little lecture on the different cell blocks and what the rules were, and all of that. So he's not looking for sympathy. He's sort of an honest broker in that regard. He mostly seems very frustrated about time, research materials, ability to correspond as much as he would like, and stuff like that. Often when I write to him, he says he has very little time to respond, or he's working hard to get something done. He's writing another book or something like that.
In all these years, did you get any feeling that his time in incarceration has changed his views about his manifesto, his mission, or his crimes?
I mean, he's not the kind of person who would reveal that necessarily. If he has any remorse about his killings, I don't think he would say so, because it would be like an unseemly reach for sympathy or something like that. Yeah, I don't think he would want to play that card.
In your writing, you pointed out that Kaczynski's papers are a popular attraction at a University of Michigan archive. Who is still interested in Kaczynski's ideas there?
Well, there's a lot of people on Facebook, lots of weird groups that reference Kaczynski, and it's hard to say how many people are involved, although some of them I saw one with 100,000 hits. Again, as I said, there's a lot of people who are very Kaczynski-esque, who deny or disavow or just won't talk about Kaczynski, in the sense that there's that sort of potent valence around him that suggests to me that he's on people's minds if they keep saying he's not on their minds. But there's also, like, explicitly, there's, a terrorist group in Latin America, and there's groups who are more active in the U.S. who aren't committing violence, but who might be in favor of it, who are, using his name or referencing him because it's so explosive, practically quote him in their own works. I think there are people who are trying to live off-grid, which is sort of an overlap with preppers. There's people who are sort of doing legal thinking. There's people who are fighting pipelines and sympathetic, but have more immediate environmental concerns. It's a big spectrum. But it's irrelevant in a way to say, are they Kaczynski inspired? Because in a way, that's just saying, are these people associated with this person with this troublesome reputation? But the overlap of ideas, the critique of technology, the desire for revolution, things that he put together in one explicit, very forceful package for the first time, I think are being mirrored by contemporary thinkers.
Sure, I think that's a fair point, that a confluence of ideas, a similarity of ideas does not indicate an endorsement of Kaczynski. But, in 2018, you wrote an article in New York Magazine about a generation of people who have been influenced by Kaczynski, and you coined a term, Kaczynski moments. What do you mean by that?
Well, I was thinking of a couple of things. One was a young man I'd met who told me about reading the manifesto for the first time, and it was, the cover had been torn off. He didn't know what it was. He just started reading it as an innocent person who was interested in anarchist ideas and all that. He was sympathetic to the general concept. And he got a little ways in, and he thought, this is like brilliant. It's genius. And he got a little farther in, and he figured out, oh, my God, this must be Ted Kaczynski. And it was a shock. And I think that's really why I wrote the story, because I saw that shock replicated on other people. There's a famous essay by Bill Joy, the founder of Sun Microsystems, I think, and he knew a person who had been wounded by one of Kaczynski's bombs, but ended up somehow having that same experience where somebody handed him some Kaczynski writings from the manifesto, and he said, wow, this is completely right, and then turned the page and saw Kaczynski's name and felt this shock, like, how could I agree with this killer? And that sort of just really caught my imagination, and I think I guess because it stands for this sort of shock that comes when you realize how climate change seems uncontrollable by the systems designed by man.
I think I'd be captivated too in these Kaczynski moments, these times in which people find themselves horrified to agree with the thoughts of a murderer. So there is this difference, this divide between Kaczynski, the murdering hermit, and Kaczynski, the thinker. But Kaczynski wanted a revolution. Still, revolutions are pretty rare things, even though radical thought has brought them about in the U.S. and France, Russia, China. Kaczynski is not a Jefferson or a Robespierre, a Lenin or a Mao. So how influential in his thinking was Kaczynski really? Well,
I mean, it's clearly, the overwhelming majority of humanity has zero interest in his thoughts. My sense has always been that when there are subterranean things happening in the culture that haven't really been out in the clear yet, it's sort of stewing away in people's minds in inchoate and not very well worked out ways. And I think it tends to be people who aren't like super well attached to normal life, conventional life, who tend to sort of receive what is happening in the culture, these unsaid things. I think that it goes throughout history. People who are sort of prophets and visionaries are not necessarily the normal guy who shows up to the office at 8 a.m., So I'm interested in phenomenons of different thinking, canaries in the coal mine kind of thing. And so looking at what is undeniably a huge growth in sort of all sorts of varieties of not anti, but a-civilizational things, like these primitive life gatherings that have really gone from a few in the 80s to hundreds now, the whole prepper movement, all the various forms of simplicity and wellness and back to the land and living light on the earth and all of that. There's a lot of that kind of thinking growing, and some of it is more radical than others. In other countries where they have more alive radical traditions, there is violence and bombings and murders with a strong anti-civ message and sometimes a explicitly Kaczynski-ish message. Also, I mean, the idea that there's a couple thousand of them in the States, as a point Dr. Kaczynski makes often is that the Russian Revolution was accomplished by 6,000 Bolsheviks. What Kaczynski's practical advice has come down to is wait for the right moment and hit a critical point in the infrastructure or the system, and you might be able to create a chain effect that brings down the system.
So we return, I guess, to this tension that Ted Kaczynski, the thinker, might have had something that we should pay attention to. But Ted Kaczynski, the activist, the revolutionary, is someone we should rightfully revile.
No, I wouldn't go that far. I think the feelings you may have about the judgments we may have, and I may have about his behavior are kind of irrelevant to what the disturbance that he felt, which is being felt, I think, by many more people as climate change and ocean acidification and species extinctions accelerate. So he was an extraordinarily rational man who was like so rational that he went over the edge and said he looked at what was happening in the history of technology and how it had grown and efforts to control it and scientific ethics and what they've done over the years. And he said, this is just going to get worse until it all falls apart. And he wrote wrote that in the 90s, as other people were warning as far back as a century. But when you see that he was so disturbed at that time, and you see that a lot of the things that he's predicted are coming true, and that other people are being disturbed by them, the question isn't how we feel about Ted Kaczynski. The question is, what are we going to do about the Ted Kaczynskis that are going to come? Because his reaction is not like one of a kind. I've always felt that when things start getting bad and people connect it, the wildfires and the flooding and everything else, there's going to be a lot of people who become unhinged, and a lot of them are going to become unhinged in that way because that model exists, even whether it has his name attached to it or not. He's more like a case study in a way than to talk about right and wrong or anything else.
John Richardson, thank you for speaking with me today.
But thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with John H. Richardson, a journalist and author of the book, My Father the Spy. Next, on American Scandal, we bring you an encore presentation of our series on the Iran-Contra affair. In the 1980s, Washington, D.C. was hit with a sensational scandal. Stories began to emerge about illegal weapons sales abroad and an attempted international coup. And as the scandal unfolded, it would threaten the presidency of Ronald Reagan and lead to a high-stakes showdown with a special prosecutor. From Wondery, this is episode 5 of the Unabomber for American Scandal. If you like our show, please give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. Be sure to tell your friends. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free. You'll also find some links and offers from our sponsors in the episode notes. Supporting them helps us keep offering our shows for free. Another way you can support the show is by filling out a small survey at Wondery.com/survey to tell us what topics we might cover next. You can also find us and me on Twitter. Search for #AmericanScandal or follow me at Lindsay A. Graham. Be sure to listen to my other podcasts too, American History Tellers and American Elections Wicked Game. American Scandal is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsay Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Molly Bach. This episode was produced by Susan Vallon. Our senior producer is Gabe Riven. Executive producers are Stephanie Jens, Jenny Lauer-Beckman, and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.